All right, let's add a new class here. We're going to call it hash table. In this class, we need an array of linked lists, and every object in these linked lists should be an entry object. So let's create an entry class first. Private class entry. I made this private because this is purely implementation detail. We don't want to expose this class outside our hash table, okay? So in this class, we need a couple of fields. One is an integer called key, and the other is a string called value. Now, it's good to add a constructor here to initialize these fields, but I'm not going to manually type it by hand. I'm going to show you a shortcut. So on the top, under the code menu, we have this generate command. The shortcut on Mac is Command and N. On Windows, it's probably Control and N. If we press this, we see the generate command palette. Here we select constructor. Now we select both our fields and hit OK. There you go. We have a constructor to initialize these fields. Beautiful. Now we need an array of linked lists. So private linked list, let's import it. We set the generic parameter to entry, and here we need an array of linked lists, not just one linked list, right? We call this array entries and initialize it like this: new linked list array. Now here in square brackets, we need to specify an initial size for this array. Let's just say 5 for simplicity, but in the future, we can always improve this and add a constructor to pass the initial capacity. Now let's implement the put method. So public void put, we need two parameters, key and value. Now the first thing we should do here is to figure out where in the entries array we should store this key value pair. This is where we use our hash function. So let's add a hash function. We're going to make this private because, once again, this is implementation detail and we don't want to expose this outside of our hash table class. If you don't understand what I'm talking about, you need to watch the second part of my Ultimate Java series. I talked about this concept in detail. So we need a private method that returns an integer. We call it hash. Here we give it a key. Now the easiest hash algorithm is return key modulus entries.length. So whatever key we have, we reduce it to the size of our array. Now in this example, we can assume that all our keys are positive, but in a real world scenario, you might want to use math.abs, which is short for absolute, to get the absolute value of the key. So if someone passes a negative value, you can convert it to a positive value. Let's not worry about it at this point. Now back to our put method. We call the hash function, give it the key, and this gives us an index where we should store this key value pair. Now we need to look at the cell at this index. If it's null, we should set it to an instance of the linked list class. So if entries of index equals null, then we're going to set entries of index to a new instance of the linked list class. Otherwise, if it's not null, that means we have at least one entry in this linked list. So we should add a new key value pair or a new entry at the end of this list. First, we should wrap this key value pair in an entry object. So we create a new entry object, new entry. And this is where we use that constructor that we just created, key and value. Now we need to grab the linked list at this position. So entries of index. This is our linked list. So we call add last and give it this new entry object. So this is a very basic implementation. But what if someone passes a duplicate key? With this implementation, we'll end up adding a duplicate entry in this linked list. So instead of always adding the entry at the end of this linked list, first we should iterate over this linked list, look at every entry. If we find an entry with the same key, we want to update its value. Otherwise, we want to append this entry at the end of our list. So here's a better algorithm. We're going to iterate over our linked list. So var entry in entries of index. Now we have repeated this in a couple of places. I would prefer to extract this in a variable called bucket. So let's do that right away. Var bucket, we set it to entries of index. And then we simply iterate over this bucket. Now, in each iteration, we need to check the key of the current entry. So if entry.key equals the same key, the key that is passed here. Then we're going to update the value. So entry.value, we set it to the new value. And here we want to return because we don't want to add the new entry at the end of this bucket, right? So let's add a code block here and return. That's it. Otherwise, if you end up here, that means we didn't find an entry with the same key, so we can add it to our bucket. Now, I'm going to simplify this code. We don't really need this separate entry variable. We can simply pass this new object over here. That's better. Also, we can replace entries of index with bucket. That is better. Now, you might ask why I didn't replace these two occurrences with bucket. We cannot do this, otherwise we're not going to be able to initialize array cells. So here we need to work directly with an array cell. So here's our put method. Next, we're going to implement the get method.